There are names that, when spoken, change the air in the room. Names that aren't just words, but curses in phonetic form. We've spoken of cosmic architects and dreaming priests. But there is another kind of horror, one that doesn't just dwell in the stars or the deep sea, but in the very medium of human thought itself. In the symbols we share, the stories we tell, and the ideas that can, once conjured, never be unthought. Today, we cross a line. We enter a space where fear is not a feeling, but an infection. Where the monster is not a physical thing to be fought, but a pattern, a meme, a concept that warps reality around it. This is not about a beast you can run from. This is about a truth you cannot escape once you've heard it. Welcome back. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's a reason I'm asking, and you'll understand why by the end. This is a documentary about something that doesn't want to be documented. We're going to examine a pattern. And this is the mind of the Unspeakable One. This is Hastur. You may know other titles. The King in Yellow. He who is not to be named. But these are not just aliases. They are warning labels. They are the safety protocols for a psychic entity whose presence is catalyzed by awareness. To know of Hastur is to begin a relationship with him. To learn his symbols is to offer him a door into your perception. To speak his name is to knock. And if you've ever wondered what it means for an idea to be alive, to be predatory, patient, and hungry, then you are already asking the question that pulls his attention. This is the forbidden knowledge that blurs the line between mind and monster. This is the understanding that some stories are not just told. They are traps. Consider this your final warning before we step inside. The play is about to begin. The yellow sign is already in your mind's eye. And he is always listening for his cue. The entity we know as Hastur began as a mistake, or rather, as an accident of literary inheritance that grew into something far stranger than any single author intended. In 1893, Ambrose Bierce published a short story called Haita the Shepherd in his collection, Can Such Things Be? The story itself is forgettable, a simple pastoral tale about a shepherd boy who encounters Hastur, described explicitly as a benevolent god of shepherds. There is nothing sinister here, nothing cosmic. Bierce borrowed the name from somewhere. Scholars remain unsure where, and used it once, carelessly, for a minor deity in a minor story. 2 years later, Robert W. Chambers read Bierce. We know this because Chambers took the name Hastur and did something unprecedented with it. In his 1895 collection, The King in Yellow, Chambers transformed Bierce's pastoral god into something that cannot be easily categorized. Hastur appears as a person, a place, and possibly an entity. The text deliberately refuses to clarify which. In The Repairer of Reputations, a character mentions the days when Hastur walked. In The Yellow Sign, Hastur seems connected to the play that drives its readers mad. Chambers never explains the relationship between Hastur, the King in Yellow, and the city of Carcosa. This ambiguity was not a flaw in his craft. It was the craft itself. Chambers was writing in the mid-1890s, during the height of decadent literature's obsession with forbidden art. His innovation was to create a fictional text, the play The King in Yellow, whose mere existence within his stories becomes the source of horror. The play appears in 4 of the collection's 10 stories, but Chambers never shows us its contents. We learn only that it drives audiences to madness, despair, and self-destruction. Hastur exists somewhere in that play's orbit, never fully defined, operating through reference and implication. Howard Phillips Lovecraft encountered the King in Yellow sometime in the early 1920s. His letters from this period reveal genuine enthusiasm for Chambers' technique. Lovecraft had been developing his own approach to cosmic horror, entities of vast age and indifference who render human concerns laughably insignificant. He recognized in Chambers a kindred strategy, the use of shared mythology to create verisimilitude. If multiple authors reference the same forbidden texts and entities, readers might begin to wonder if these things possessed some reality beyond fiction. In 1930, Lovecraft included Hastur in The Whisperer in Darkness, listing the name alongside Cthulhu and other entities in a passage describing forbidden knowledge. The mention is brief, almost casual, but it accomplished something crucial. Lovecraft legitimized Chambers' creation by incorporating it into his growing mythos. He treated Hastur as if the entity had always existed in the same cosmic taxonomy as his own inventions. This act of literary borrowing, Lovecraft called it the Yog-Sothoth school of writing, created a false archaeology. Future readers would find Hastur in both Chambers and Lovecraft and assume a deeper connection than actually existed. August Derleth, Lovecraft's posthumous editor and self-appointed systematizer, took this process further. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth began publishing stories that organized the loose, contradictory mythos into a coherent system. In his 1939 story, The Return of Hastur, Derleth assigned Hastur specific attributes: an air elemental, a half-brother to Cthulhu, locked in eternal cosmic conflict between good and evil. This systematization violated everything that made Chambers and Lovecraft's approaches effective. Where they had created mystery through omission, Derleth provided answers. Where they had suggested vast, incomprehensible forces, Derleth drew clear battle lines. The result is that Hastur exists in multiple contradictory forms across different authors and decades. There is no definitive version, no canonical text that resolves the confusion. This absence of authority has become, paradoxically, the entity's most distinctive feature. Hastur is what happens when collaborative mythology develops without coordination. A figure that accumulates meanings and loses coherence with each new telling. Robert W. Chambers did not invent the concept of art that corrupts its audience. He was writing at the end of a century, obsessed with degeneration, decadence, and the dangerous seductiveness of beauty. To understand why The King in Yellow resonated so powerfully in 1895, we must examine the intellectual climate that made its central premise, forbidden aesthetic experience, seem not only plausible but urgently relevant. The 1890s marked the peak of degeneration theory in European and American thought. Max Nordau's Degeneration, published in 1892, argued that modern art itself was a symptom of biological and moral decline. Nordau claimed that exposure to decadent literature and symbolist poetry could literally damage the nervous system, weakening both individuals and entire societies. This was not fringe thinking. Nordau's work was widely read, translated, debated. The idea that art could function as a pathogen had medical and scientific credibility. Chambers absorbed this discourse and inverted it. Rather than depicting art that weakens through moral corruption, he imagined art that destroys through metaphysical revelation. The play The King in Yellow does not make its audiences degenerate. It shows them something that human consciousness cannot process. This distinction matters. Chambers was not moralizing about decadent content. He was suggesting that certain truths exist beyond the safe boundaries of human perception. The French symbolists provided another crucial influence. Stéphane Mallarmé, writing in the 1880s and 1890s, explored the concept of the impossible poem, a text that could evoke meanings beyond the capacity of language to express. Mallarmé believed that true poetry approached pure suggestion, that the most powerful artistic effect came from what remained unsaid. His famous poem, Un coup de dé, experimented with typography and space to suggest rather than state meaning. Chambers adopted this aesthetic philosophy and weaponized it. If language could point toward the inexpressible, what happened when the inexpressible was not beautiful but annihilating? European mysticism had long maintained that certain divine names were too powerful to speak aloud. The Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God in Hebrew tradition, could only be uttered by the high priest in the Holy of Holies, and then only once per year. Speaking the name incorrectly or in the wrong context could bring destruction. This theological tradition of the dangerous name appears throughout Chambers' work. Hastur becomes an entity defined by prohibition. He is the unspeakable one, not because describing him is difficult, but because the act of naming invokes presence. Theater itself carried an aura of dangerous transformation in the late 19th century. Actual plays had been banned or shut down for causing riots, moral outrage, or psychological distress. The 1896 premiere of Alfred Jarry's Ubu Roi in Paris sparked a 15-minute shouting match in the audience that nearly turned violent. Oscar Wilde's Salome was banned in England for depicting biblical characters on stage. The idea that a theatrical performance could fundamentally alter its audience, could break down the barrier between representation and reality, had historical precedent. Yellow, as a symbolic color, carried specific cultural weight. In medieval Europe, yellow marked plague houses and identified traitors. Judas was traditionally depicted in yellow robes. The color suggested contamination, betrayal, and decay. But yellow also appeared in mystical contexts. The golden light of divine revelation, the illumination that precedes transcendence. Chambers exploited this dual association. The yellow sign functions as both warning and invitation, both corruption and enlightenment. The color itself becomes unstable, unable to settle into a single meaning. These influences converged in Chambers' work to create something genuinely new, a horror of epistemology rather than ontology. The monster was not a thing that existed in physical space. The monster was knowledge that unmade the knower. This philosophical move from what if terrible things exist to what if knowing certain truths destroys the capacity to know anything would become central to cosmic horror. Hastur, more than any other entity in the tradition, embodies this shift. The name Hastur carries no clear origin, and this etymological mystery has become part of the entity's mystique. Bierce never explained where he found the name. Scholars have proposed various sources, none entirely convincing. Some suggest a connection to the Assyrian god Ashur, the chief deity of the Assyrian pantheon. Others point toward Persian Astur, though no such figure exists in documented Persian mythology. The name might be Bierce's invention entirely, chosen for its sound. Harsh, guttural, alien. What matters is that the name arrived without pedigree, without the weight of real mythology behind it. This etymological emptiness allowed later authors to fill the name with meaning. When Chambers adopted Hastur He was working with a blank slate. The name had no established associations, no cultural baggage. Chambers could shape it into whatever his stories required. In practice, this meant keeping the name deliberately vague, using it in different contexts that seemed to refer to different things. The name became a placeholder, a variable in an equation that readers were invited to solve, knowing that no solution actually existed. The titles associated with Hastur multiply across texts, each adding layers of prohibition and danger. The Unspeakable One suggests not difficulty of description, but active prohibition. Speaking of this entity is forbidden, dangerous, or impossible. Him who is not to be named operates similarly, though the phrasing implies that the prohibition comes from external authority rather than inherent danger. These titles function as theological markers. They place Hastur in a category with entities whose names carry power, whose invocation is not reference but summoning. Compare this to the Tetragrammaton tradition. In Hebrew mysticism, the true name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah, depending on vocalization, became too sacred to pronounce. Jews developed the practice of saying Adonai, Lord, instead, or writing GD with the vowel removed. The name itself was understood to contain divine power. Speaking it correctly could tear open the veil between worlds. Speaking it incorrectly could bring annihilation. Hastur inherits this logic but inverts its moral framework. The prohibition exists not to protect the sacred, but to protect the profane, to protect humanity from contact with something that should remain unreachable. Carcosa appears first in Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa, 1886, where it functions as a ruined city somewhere in the deserts of Central Asia. The narrator wanders through mist and eventually realizes he is a ghost, that Carcosa is his own city's ruins centuries after his death. Bierce treats Carcosa as a place of loss and temporal dislocation. Chambers took this setting and transformed it into something far stranger. In The King in Yellow, Carcosa becomes a city that might be real, might be a dream, might be another dimension entirely. Characters speak of Carcosa as if it were a destination one could reach, but the text never confirms whether anyone actually arrives there. The Lake of Hali presents similar problems. Chambers mentions it repeatedly. The Lake of Hali borders Carcosa, reflects its twin suns, holds some crucial relationship to the King in Yellow. But Chambers never describes Hali in concrete terms. Is it water? Is it a boundary between dimensions? The name itself sounds alien, chosen for its phonetic strangeness rather than linguistic meaning. When Lovecraft later referenced both Carcosa and Hali in his own stories, he was not confirming their existence, but participating in the game of false authentication. These are names that gesture toward a mythology that does not, in fact, exist beyond the gesturing itself. The yellow sign represents the ultimate problem of symbolic language in Hastur mythology. Chambers describes it in contradictory ways, a physical object that characters pass between them, a symbol that can be drawn or painted, a mark that appears spontaneously. The sign supposedly carries corrupting power. To see it is to be affected by it. But Chambers never draws the sign in his text, never provides enough description for readers to visualize it clearly. This absence is crucial. A symbol that corrupts through observation cannot actually be shown to the audience without either betraying the premise or risking the same corruption. The yellow sign exists as a concept, not an image. It is the idea of a dangerous symbol, forever deferred. Later authors attempted to design actual yellow signs. Game designers, comic artists, occult practitioners. These attempts invariably disappoint because they make concrete what must remain abstract. The moment you see a specific symbol, you can evaluate it, dismiss it, recognize it as human-made. The power of Chambers' yellow sign comes from its absence. Every reader imagines their own version, unique, and therefore perfectly calibrated to their individual sources of unease. The sign becomes a Rorschach blot onto which readers project their own intuitions of visual wrongness. This linguistic and symbolic strategy, names without etymology, places without geography, symbols without form, creates a mythology that cannot be pinned down. Every attempt to define Hastur more precisely weakens the entity's effect. The moment we know exactly what Hastur is, where Carcosa exists, what the yellow sign looks like, the horror dissipates. We're left with explicable fiction instead of suggestive dread. The genius of Chambers' approach, and Lovecraft's continuation of it, lies in recognizing that cosmic horror functions through strategic gaps. Spaces where meaning should be, but isn't, where the reader's imagination works against them by attempting to fill voids that should remain empty. The creation of false mythology requires specific techniques. An author cannot simply invent a god and expect readers to treat it as more than obvious fiction. The entity must arrive with context, with a history that implies existence before and beyond the story being told. It must appear embedded in a world that seems to contain more information than the narrative reveals. Robert W. Chambers understood this principle instinctively, and his approach to myth-building established patterns that cosmic horror would follow for the next century. Chambers' central innovation was the fictional text within the text. The King in Yellow play exists only as a referenced artifact inside Chambers' stories. Characters read it, discuss it, quote from its first act, and react to its catastrophic second act. But Chambers never shows us the play itself. This technique creates a kind of narrative resonance. The play feels more real than if Chambers had written it out, because absence suggests depth. A fully written play could be evaluated and found wanting. An unwritten play remains perfectly horrifying in potential. Consider the architecture of the yellow sign as a case study. The protagonist, an artist, learns about the play from his model, who has heard rumors. Neither has read it. Later, they discover a copy. The story moves toward the moment when they will open the book and read the forbidden second act. But Chambers cuts away before this happens. The narrative jumps forward. We see only the aftermath, madness, death, transformation. By structuring the story this way, Chambers makes the play simultaneously central and absent. Its power derives from the gap it creates in the narrative. Lovecraft adopted this technique and expanded it into a deliberate program. He called it the Yog-Sothoth School of Writing, after his own invented entity. The method was simple. Write stories that referenced not only your own inventions, but those of other writers working in similar territory. Lovecraft would mention Chambers' Hastur alongside his own Cthulhu. He would cite Clark Ashton Smith's Book of Ibon alongside his own Necronomicon. These cross-references created the illusion of a shared universe, or more precisely, the illusion of a real mythology that multiple authors had independently discovered. The Necronomicon represents the perfection of this technique. Lovecraft invented the book in his 1924 story, The Hound, describing it as a blasphemous Arab text, written by the mad poet Abdul al-Hazred. Over subsequent stories, Lovecraft built up the Necronomicon's history, written in Damascus around 730 AD, translated into Greek in 950, into Latin in 1228, banned by various authorities, surviving in only 5 copies worldwide. He provided bibliographic details that mimicked real scholarly apparatus. He had his characters consult the Necronomicon in university libraries and private collections. And crucially, he had the Necronomicon mention entities invented by other writers, including Hastur. This created a feedback loop of false authentication. Readers encountered Hastur in both Chambers and Lovecraft. They encountered references to the same cities, Carcosa, the Lake of Hali. The repetition across unrelated texts suggested that these authors were describing something that actually existed. Some readers began to believe. Others played along with the game, writing to libraries and bookstores requesting copies of the Necronomicon. The Coxin boundary between fiction and hoax became intentionally unclear. August Derleth later systematized this process, creating what he called the Cthulhu Mythos, a term Lovecraft never used and probably would have rejected. Derleth established hierarchies of entities, assigned them elemental attributes, mapped out cosmic genealogies. He turned Lovecraft's loose collection of suggestions into something resembling a coherent mythology. This systematization made the material more accessible, but less effective. The moment you can chart out the relationships between entities on a diagram, the cosmic vastness shrinks to manageable proportions. Mystery becomes taxonomy. The collaborative nature of this mythology building created genuine ambiguity about authorship and authority. Who owns Hastur? Bierce invented the name. Chambers gave it meaning. Lovecraft legitimized it. Derleth codified it. Later writers, Ramsey Campbell, Carl Edward Wagner, Thomas Ligotti, have continued to modify and expand the mythology because no single author controls the entity, no single version can claim definitive status. Hastur exists in a state of perpetual revision, each new story adding layers that contradict or complicate previous versions. This collaborative instability has an unexpected effect. It makes Hastur feel older and more real than entities with clear authorial origins. We know exactly where Cthulhu comes from. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu in 1928. But Hastur's origins are murky, spread across multiple authors and decades, confused by contradictory accounts. The entity seems to have emerged from somewhere beyond authorial invention, as if Bierce, Chambers, and Lovecraft were all transcribing something they had discovered rather than created. This is the ultimate achievement of cosmic horror's myth-building technique, making fiction feel like folklore. Folklore has no author. It accumulates through retelling, changes across regions and generations, exists in multiple, contradictory versions simultaneously. By treating invented mythology as if it were folklore, these authors created entities that resist the usual fictional boundaries. Hastur, more than most, benefits from this ambiguity. The entity that cannot be clearly defined, cannot be spoken, cannot be known, also cannot be pinned down to a single author or text. The mythology itself enacts the cosmic horror it describes, knowledge that fragments the more you try to grasp it, meaning that dissolves under scrutiny, truth that becomes falsehood when examined closely. Cosmic horror operates on a specific philosophical premise. The universe is not built to accommodate human consciousness. Our minds evolved to navigate immediate survival concerns, predators, food sources, social hierarchies. We developed pattern recognition, causal reasoning, narrative construction. These cognitive tools work adequately for daily existence, but fail catastrophically when confronted with phenomena that operate outside their parameters. Hastur represents the formalization of this failure. The entity exists as a concept that exceeds the mind's ability to process it safely. This differs fundamentally from physical threat. A monster you can fight, escape, or kill presents a problem with potential solutions. Death itself remains comprehensible, a biological end state that human cultures have extensively ritualized and processed. But epistemic threat operates differently. The danger is not that Hastur will kill you, but that encountering Hastur will break the cognitive structures through which you understand reality. You continue living, but you, as a coherent consciousness, ceases to function. This is horror of a higher order. Chambers understood this instinctively. His play The King in Yellow does not frighten audiences through shocking content. The first act is described as beautiful, strange, but not inherently disturbing. The catastrophe occurs in the second act, though Chambers never specifies what that act contains. The implication is clear. The second act presents information that human minds cannot integrate without structural damage. Knowledge itself becomes toxic. Entropy provides another key concept. In thermodynamics, entropy measures disorder in a closed system. All systems tend toward maximum entropy, perfect disorder, heat death, the cessation of meaningful difference. Hastur functions as entropic force applied to meaning rather than matter. Language degrades in proximity to the entity. Symbols lose their referential stability. The yellow sign represents this perfectly, a symbol that cannot maintain stable meaning, that corrupts other symbols through contact, that eventually renders all signification impossible. Lovecraft expanded this idea into his core philosophical stance, sometimes called cosmicism. Humans occupy no privileged position in the universe. Our existence is accidental, brief, and meaningless on cosmic scales. The entities in Lovecraft's stories represent this indifference. They neither love nor hate humanity. We simply don't register as significant enough to warrant attention. Hastur fits awkwardly into this framework because the entity seems specifically interested in human consciousness. The play targets audiences. The yellow sign affects observers. This suggests not cosmic indifference but selective attention, which raises disturbing questions about intent. The contagion model of ideas appears repeatedly in Hastur mythology. Information spreads through observation, reading, conversation. You cannot protect yourself through physical barriers because the threat is not physical. Quarantine fails when the pathogen is an idea. This anticipates modern concepts from memetics. Richard Dawkins' proposal that ideas reproduce and evolve using human minds as substrate. A meme, in the original sense, is a unit of cultural information that propagates through communication. Chambers imagined a hostile meme decades before the terminology existed. The yellow sign is an idea that wants to spread, that modifies host behavior to facilitate its own transmission. Aesthetic corruption represents perhaps the most sophisticated horror concept in Chambers' work. Beauty itself becomes the vector for destruction. The play The King in Yellow is apparently aesthetically accomplished. Characters describe the first act in terms of artistic merit. This creates a problem. If dangerous knowledge arrived in repulsive form, people would instinctively avoid it. But when it arrives as great art, as transcendent aesthetic experience, people seek it out. They voluntarily expose themselves. The horror lies in recognizing that our highest cultural achievements, art, philosophy, literature, might open doors to things that should remain closed. This inverts the romantic conception of artistic transcendence. Romantic poets believed that aesthetic experience could elevate consciousness, bring humans closer to ultimate truth or beauty. Chambers suggest the opposite. Some truths annihilate rather than elevate. Transcendence, if it occurs, might involve the dissolution of the self that seeks it. Mystical experience and psychosis become indistinguishable. The seeker who achieves union with cosmic reality discovers that this reality is incompatible with continued sanity. These philosophical concepts, epistemic threat, entropy of meaning, hostile information, aesthetic corruption, form the intellectual architecture of Hastur mythology. The entity serves as embodiment of dangerous knowledge, the symbol that breaks symbolic thought, the play that should not be performed, the name that invokes presence through its utterance. Hastur is not a creature to be fought, but a philosophical proposition. Some forms of understanding are inherently destructive to the understander. Hastur's nature remains fundamentally ambiguous across the texts that invoke the entity. This ambiguity is not authorial failure, but the defining characteristic. We must examine what is claimed about Hastur, while recognizing that these claims often contradict each other, that no single account can be taken as authoritative, and that the confusion itself might be the point. In Chambers' original work, Hastur appears primarily as a name associated with the play The King in yellow and the city of Carcosa. The relationship between these three elements, Hastur, the King, and Carcosa, remains deliberately unclear. Are they aspects of a single phenomenon, separate entities in alliance, different names for the same thing? Chambers provides no answers. In The Repairer of Reputations, a character mentions the days when Hastur walked, suggesting historical existence as an entity capable of physical manifestation. But this character is demonstrably insane, the entire story presented through his unreliable narration. We cannot trust his testimony. The King in Yellow presents equal difficulty. Is this figure identical to Hastur or separate? The King appears throughout Chambers' stories as a character in the play, but also seems to exist independently of the theatrical performance. Characters speak of encountering the King, of seeing the pallid mask, of recognizing certain figures in yellow robes as heralds or avatars. The King might be Hastur's manifestation, or Hastur's servant, or an entirely distinct entity that shares thematic connections. The text supports multiple interpretations and confirms none. Lovecraft's incorporation of Hastur into his mythos added new complications. In The Whisperer in Darkness, Hastur appears in a list alongside Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and other cosmic entities. This placement suggests Hastur belongs to the category of Great Old Ones, vast beings of immense age who existed before humanity and will exist after, whose nature and motivations remain fundamentally alien. Lovecraft provides no additional detail. The name appears, establishes presence, creates resonance with Chambers' work, then vanishes. This restraint is crucial. Lovecraft understood that explanation diminishes mystery. August Derleth's systematization forced Hastur into a specific role. In Derleth's schema, the Great Old Ones divide into elemental categories locked in cosmic conflict. Hastur becomes an air elemental, associated with wind and storm, positioned as Cthulhu's half-brother and rival. Derleth's stories describe Hastur as imprisoned somewhere in the vicinity of Aldebaran, a real star in the constellation Taurus. This concreteness violates the original ambiguity. By giving Hastur specific location, attributes, and relationships, Derleth reduced the entity to manageable fictional terms. The problem with Derleth's approach becomes clear when compared to Chambers' method. Chambers' horror derives from uncertainty. You never know what Hastur actually is, so your imagination fills the void with personal fears. Derleth's horror derives from knowing too much. Here's the monster. Here are its powers. Here's how it fits into cosmic hierarchy. The first approach is genuinely unsettling. The second is conventional fantasy. Associated entities further complicate the picture. The pallid mask appears in several Chambers stories, sometimes as worn by the king in yellow, sometimes as an object with independent significance. Is the mask a face, a disguise, or something that replaces the face? Characters who encounter it seem unable to process what they've seen. In later expansions, particularly in role-playing games, Hastur supposedly commands various servitor beings, the Biakhi, bat-winged creatures that fly between dimensions, the yellow sign worshippers who form cults in his name, other entities that vary wildly depending on which author you consult. Carcosa itself might be an entity rather than merely a location. The city appears differently to different observers. It might exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, or shift between states, or exist primarily as a mental construct that manifests under certain conditions. The Lake of Holly, similarly, functions as a boundary or threshold, perhaps the edge between reality and whatever Carcosa represents. Water frequently serves as liminal space in mythology, the border between worlds. Holly might be literal water or symbolic representation of cognitive dissolution. These entities and forces, Hastur, the king, the mask, Carcosa, Holly, the sign, the play itself, form a constellation rather than a hierarchy. They relate to each other in ways that resist simple mapping. This resistance to taxonomy is essential. The moment you create a clear organizational chart, you've domesticated the horror. You've made it comprehensible, and comprehensibility defeats cosmic dread. Hastur remains effective precisely because we cannot determine what it is, how its associated elements connect, or whether we're dealing with one entity or many phenomena that human observers mistakenly group together under a single name. The question of how humans encounter Hastur reveals the entity's unique position in cosmic horror. Unlike Cthulhu, who sleeps in a sunken city awaiting specific astronomical conditions, Hastur operates through cultural transmission. The entity does not require physical manifestation. The play, the book, the symbol. These artifacts function as vectors. Human interaction with Hastur begins through aesthetic and intellectual engagement, which makes the threat simultaneously more subtle and more pervasive. Chambers' stories establish the pattern. In The Yellow Sign, the artist protagonist first encounters the entity through dreams, vague visions of Carcosa, impressions of the king in yellow. These dreams intensify when he sees the yellow sign itself, which appears on a passing hearse. Later, a copy of The King in Yellow play arrives. The progression moves from unconscious intrusion to visual encounter to literary exposure. Each stage increases the entity's influence. The final catastrophe occurs only after the protagonist and his model read the play's second act, though Chambers never shows us this reading. We see only aftermath, their bodies discovered in attitudes suggesting both horror and acceptance. This gradual corruption model appears throughout Hastur mythology. The entity does not strike instantly. Initial contact might seem harmless, a strange dream, an unusual symbol, hearing about a forbidden play. Curiosity leads to investigation. Investigation leads to exposure. Exposure leads to transformation. The victim becomes accomplice in their own destruction because human psychology drives us toward forbidden knowledge. We cannot resist examining what we're told not to examine. artists and creative intellectuals appear particularly vulnerable. Chambers populates his stories with painters, writers, architects, people whose work involves perceiving reality carefully and representing it through symbolic systems. This vulnerability makes sense. If Hastur operates through information and symbol, those who work most deeply with information and symbol offer optimal hosts. The artist's developed perception becomes liability. They notice what others miss. They see patterns that should remain invisible. Their trained ability to represent complex ideas through aesthetic form makes them ideal transmitters of the contamination. The madness that results from Hastur contact differs from clinical psychiatric conditions. Characters do not simply lose cognitive function. Instead, they gain access to perceptions that human neurology cannot safely process. They see Carcosa overlaid on their normal environment. They recognize the king in yellow in ordinary people wearing yellow garments. They understand the yellow sign's meaning, though this understanding cannot be communicated through language. This is not loss of sanity, but catastrophic expansion of awareness beyond safe parameters. Some characters experience compulsion to speak the unspeakable. They know that discussing Hastur spreads the contagion, yet they cannot stop themselves from warning others, from trying to explain what they have learned. This creates a tragic paradox. The responsible action is to warn people away from danger, but the act of warning requires describing the danger, which itself serves as transmission vector. The only safe approach is silence, but silence allows the entity to claim more victims. There is no good choice. Physical transformation occurs in several stories, though its exact nature varies. Characters are found dead in circumstances that suggest they did not simply expire, but were somehow taken or altered. In the yellow sign, the protagonist's body shows signs of struggle, while the model's body appears composed, as if she accepted her fate. The watchman who served as Hastur's herald is later found in a condition the text describes vaguely, leaving readers to imagine decomposition or transformation beyond death. The yellow taint appears physically on bodies, in rooms, on objects, a kind of residue marking contact with the entity. Social contagion follows predictable patterns once established in a community. One person reads the play and begins acting strangely. Others notice. Curiosity spreads. More people seek out the forbidden text. The contamination ripples outward through social networks. In The Repairer of Reputations, set in an alternate 1920s, where the play's influence has become widespread, society shows signs of structural collapse. Government-sanctioned suicide chambers operate openly. People casually discuss the king in yellow and Carcosa as if these are accepted parts of reality. The story never clarifies whether this represents mass delusion or actual transformation of the world itself. The concept of forbidden knowledge carries specific philosophical implications that Hastur mythology explores with unusual rigor. We're not discussing information that is merely dangerous to possess. Nuclear weapon designs, biological warfare techniques, methods for creating suffering. Those represent knowledge that is dangerous to apply. Hastur concerns knowledge dangerous to know. The distinction is crucial. The information itself, independent of any action taken based on it, damages the consciousness that comprehends it. This premise requires justification. Why should mere knowledge be inherently harmful? The answer lies in how human cognition functions. Our brains construct models of reality based on sensory input, filtered through cognitive structures that evolved for specific survival tasks. These models work adequately for navigating ordinary experience, but rely on certain foundational assumptions. Causality operates consistently. Objects persist when unobserved. Other minds exist and function similarly to our own. Reality remains stable between observations. These assumptions are useful simplifications rather than metaphysical truths, but we cannot function without them. Forbidden knowledge, in the cosmic horror sense, consists of information that contradicts these foundational assumptions so fundamentally that the cognitive model cannot accommodate it. The mind attempts to integrate the new information, finds that integration requires abandoning core assumptions and fractures under the contradiction. This is not metaphorical. The phenomenological experience would resemble severe psychosis, the dissolution of boundaries between self and world, loss of temporal continuity, inability to maintain stable object relations. But unlike clinical psychosis, this breakdown results from accurately perceiving something real that consciousness cannot safely process. The play, The King in Yellow, supposedly contains this category of knowledge. Chambers never specifies what the second act reveals. Readers are told only that it destroys those who experience it. Various interpretations have been proposed. Perhaps the second act demonstrates that reality is a dream, that individual consciousness is illusion, that all human experience is arbitrary construction without foundation. Perhaps it reveals the existence of entities so vast and indifferent that human meaning becomes impossible to sustain. Perhaps it shows that time is not linear, that cause and effect are illusory, that the self is not continuous. Any of these revelations, if experienced as genuine truth rather than abstract philosophy, might produce the effects Chambers describes. The difference between reading about these ideas in a philosophy text and directly experiencing them as phenomenological reality is the difference between discussing vertigo and standing at the edge of a cliff. Intellectual knowledge remains separate from embodied experience. The play, apparently, forces embodied experience of truths that should remain abstract. The yellow sign functions as a compressed version of this process, a symbol that contains too much meaning, that forces consciousness to process information beyond its capacity. In semiotics, signs are arbitrary. The word tree has no inherent connection to actual trees. We simply agree on the association. But Chambers imagines a sign that is not arbitrary, that somehow encodes direct relationship to what it signifies. Seeing the yellow sign is not seeing a representation of something. It is making actual contact with the thing itself, mediated through visual symbol. This violates the protective barrier between sign and referent that makes symbolic thought safe. The paradox of warning emerges clearly here. Anyone who comprehends the danger of Hastur-related knowledge faces an impossible choice. Remaining silent allows others to stumble into the same trap. Warning people requires explaining what they should avoid, which itself spreads awareness of the entity. Even vague warnings create curiosity. The safest approach, complete silence, allowing the entity to be forgotten, feels morally unacceptable if you believe you can save others. This is the epistemic trap. Knowledge that should not exist cannot be safely communicated and cannot be ethically concealed. Chambers' solution is to write stories that describe the danger without triggering it. His fiction operates as safe simulation. You learn about Hastur without actually encountering Hastur. But this solution contains its own problems. Every story about the entity increases awareness of the entity. Every fictional treatment adds to the cultural repository of Hastur-related information. At what point does fictional exploration become actual invocation? If the entity is real within the fiction's internal logic, do readers who engage deeply with that fiction establish contact with what the fiction describes? These questions have no answers, which is precisely why they generate unease. The ultimate implication is that certain truths are incompatible with conscious existence. Reality might contain aspects that, if known directly, would end the possibility of being a knowing subject. We persist as functional consciousnesses only through useful ignorance. The cosmic horror lies in suspecting this is true while being unable to verify it without self-destruction. Hastur serves as embodiment of this philosophical horror. The thing you cannot safely know, cannot unknow once known, and cannot prevent others from seeking. The entity that exists in the space between ignorance and annihilation, forever approaching but never quite arriving, until suddenly it has arrived and it is too late to retreat. The literary archaeology of Hastur reveals how an entity can be constructed through accumulation rather than singular invention. We must trace the textual record chronologically to understand how meaning accreted around this name, how each author's contribution altered what came before, and how readers retrospectively imposed coherence on what was essentially collaborative improvisation across decades. Ambrose Bierce's Haita the Shepherd appeared in the San Tiozetsanao Francisco Examiner in 1893 before being collected in Can Such Things Be? The story itself is minor work. A shepherd boy encounters Hastur, god of shepherds, who teaches him about happiness and its loss. The deity is explicitly benevolent, described in pastoral terms with no sinister qualities. Bierce was experimenting with mythological names, creating the impression of ancient religious traditions. He likely chose Hastur for its phonetic strangeness, possibly deriving it from Assyrian sources or inventing it entirely. The story has no lasting impact except for introducing this single name into American literature. Robert W. Chambers encountered Bierce's work sometime before 1895. We know he read Bierce because Chambers also borrowed Carcosa from another Bierce story, an inhabitant of Carcosa from 1886. In that story, Carcosa is a ruined city in Central Asia whose narrator realizes he is a ghost, wandering his own city's future decay. Chambers extracted these two names, Hastur and Carcosa, and rebuilt them into something unrecognizable from their origins. The King in Yellow collection appeared in 1895, containing 10 stories, 4 of which directly reference the forbidden play. The Repairer of Reputations opens the collection with an alternate history 1920s America, where the play has already corrupted society. The Mask follows with another story set in this transformed world. In the Court of the Dragon presents a man pursued by a mysterious figure through Paris. The Yellow Sign concludes the Hastur sequence with the artist and model who read the play and suffer its consequences. The remaining 6 stories are conventional romances, which makes the collection structure deliberately disorienting. Cosmic horror yielding to normalcy, as if even Chambers could not sustain the intensity. Chambers never wrote a sequel or expansion. He abandoned cosmic horror after this single collection, moving to commercial romance fiction that made him wealthy and critically forgotten. The King in Yellow fell out of print, became a collector's item, existed primarily as rumor for decades. But Lovecraft discovered it, probably through used bookstores or references in other weird fiction, sometime in the early 1920s. Lovecraft's letters from 1927 mention Chambers favorably. He recognized a kindred approach, using suggested mythology to create verisimilitude, leaving central horrors undefined, treating cosmic entities as facts within the story world. In The Whisperer in Darkness, written in 1930, Lovecraft has a character recite a list of forbidden names: Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, Nyarlathotep, Hastur. This single mention accomplished everything Lovecraft needed. He authenticated Chambers' invention by placing it alongside his own, suggested a shared cosmology, and invited readers to believe both authors were transcribing real mythology rather than inventing fiction. Lovecraft repeated the technique in The Thing on the Doorstep, 1933, where a character mentions reading about Hastur in forbidden texts. These casual references, never developed, never explained, proved more effective than extensive description would have been. Lovecraft understood that mystery requires restraint. He borrowed the name, acknowledged Chambers, and moved on, leaving readers to wonder about connections he never intended to clarify. Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft's close friend and fellow writer, made his own contribution. Smith's The Return of the Sorcerer, 1931, references a book called The Necronomicon, alongside other forbidden texts. Smith was participating in the same game, cross-referencing other writers' inventions to create false authentication. His stories mentioned entities from Lovecraft's work, while Lovecraft mentioned Smith's invented gods. This collaboration was conscious and deliberate, discussed in their correspondence. They were building a shared mythology through mutual citation. August Derleth entered the picture after Lovecraft's death in 1937. Derleth had been Lovecraft's correspondent and considered himself heir to the mythos. His story, The Return of Hastur, appeared in 1939, fundamentally altering the entity's nature. Derleth assigned Hastur elemental attributes, invented cosmic conflicts, provided explicit descriptions. His systematization made the material more accessible, but destroyed the ambiguity that made it effective. Later anthologies and reference works would struggle to reconcile Chambers' undefined entity with Derleth's concrete demon, creating confusion that persists today. The intertextual connections form a web of false references, each author treating another's invention as established mythology, readers encountering the same names in multiple unrelated texts, the accumulation suggesting depth that does not actually exist. This is collaborative world-building through strategic citation, a technique that would influence fantasy and horror writing for decades. Hastur exists because multiple authors agreed to pretend it existed, and that collective pretense created something that feels older and more real than any single author's invention could be. The yellow sign represents Chambers' most refined articulation of Hastur-related horror. The story operates through careful accumulation of uncanny detail, building from minor disturbances toward catastrophic revelation, while maintaining enough ambiguity that readers must construct the horror themselves. We should examine its structure and technique to understand how cosmic horror functions at the level of craft. The story opens with the narrator, an artist, painting a model named Tessie in his Washington Square studio. The setup is deliberately ordinary, professional artistic work, conventional Victorian propriety between painter and subject. Chambers establishes normalcy before introducing disturbance. This is essential technique. Horror requires baseline reality against which the intrusion registers as genuinely wrong. The first disturbance arrives through dreams. Both artist and model have been experiencing nightmares about Carcosa, about the Lake of Hali, about figures in tattered yellow robes. They discuss these dreams hesitantly, unsure whether to treat them as coincidence or significance. Chambers never explains why both characters dream the same imagery, Shared dreams suggest either telepathic connection or external influence from something transmitting these visions. Neither explanation is confirmed. The second disturbance is the watchman. A hearse driver, described as corpse-like, appears repeatedly near the studio. His presence disturbs both characters, though they cannot articulate why. He drives slowly past, stares at the windows, seems to be waiting. The watchman carries or displays the yellow sign, though the story never describes this symbol precisely. Tessie sees it and reacts with visceral horror. The artist sees it and feels contaminated. The sign becomes central to the story without ever being defined, a masterful use of strategic absence. The third intrusion comes through a book. The artist discovers a copy of The King in yellow play, though he does not remember acquiring it. Books appearing without explanation is classic Gothic technique, but Chambers updates it for psychological horror. The book represents not supernatural intervention, but the idea's own agency, knowledge that propagates itself, that arranges circumstances to ensure its own transmission. The artist knows the book is dangerous. Tessie begs him not to read it, but curiosity operates as compulsion. They read the first act together. Chambers describes the first act as strange but beautiful, disturbing in atmosphere but not in content. This distinction is crucial. If the play were obviously horrifying, no one would read past the opening, but it's aesthetically accomplished, even transcendent. The danger arrives only in the second act, which the characters approach with full knowledge that it will destroy them. Chambers cuts away before showing us what they read. This narrative gap is where the story's power concentrates. The ending arrives abruptly. Days later, neighbors discover the bodies. The artist and Tessie are dead in the studio, positioned to suggest they saw something that drove them beyond endurance. The watchman is also found, though his condition is described vaguely, corrupted, transformed, carrying the yellow taint that marks contact with the entity. The story ends with no explanation, no resolution, just the fact of catastrophe that followed forbidden knowledge. What makes the yellow sign effective is what it refuses to do. Chambers never explains what Hastur is, never describes the yellow sign clearly, never shows us the play's second act, never clarifies the watchman's nature or purpose. Every central element remains undefined. This forces readers to imagine their own versions, which necessarily reflect their individual fears and conceptual vulnerabilities. The story becomes customized horror, uniquely calibrated to each reader's psychology. The technique also creates permanent unease. A story that explains its monster can be mentally resolved. You understand what happened, integrate it as fiction, and move on. But a story that withholds explanation cannot be resolved. The gaps persist in memory as open questions. Years later, you might still wonder what the second act contained, what the yellow sign looked like, what happened in that studio. The story continues working long after you finish reading it. Chambers' prose style reinforces this effect. He writes in clear, restrained sentences. No Gothic excess, no melodramatic description. The horror emerges through what characters observe and fail to understand, through careful notation of details that don't cohere into explanation. This documentary style, as if the narrator is simply recording events without interpreting them, makes the impossible seem factual. You're not being told a ghost story. You're being presented with testimony that happens to describe impossible events. The yellow sign established the template for Hastur stories. Ordinary people, artistic or intellectual profession, gradual intrusion of uncanny elements, forbidden text as transmission vector, catastrophic encounter with knowledge that should remain unknown. Later writers would follow this structure, with varying success. But Chambers' original remains most effective because he had the discipline to withhold what later writers would over-explain. The story is a masterclass in absence as technique, in suggestion as stronger than statement, in horror that operates through what is carefully not shown. The Repairer of Reputations opens the king in Yellow Collection and immediately destabilizes reader confidence. The story presents itself as straightforward narrative, first-person account of recent events, but systematically undermines its own reliability. By the end, we cannot determine what actually occurred versus what exists only in the narrator's delusions. This radical uncertainty about the story's reality status becomes the primary source of horror. The narrator, Hildred Castaigne, describes an alternate 1920s America. 25 years before Chambers' actual writing date, yet he sets the story in the future, a future where the king in yellow play has circulated widely and transformed society. The government operates lethal chambers where citizens can choose suicide, a service that has become socially acceptable and widely used. This single detail establishes that something has gone profoundly wrong with this world's values and psychology. Hildred explains that he suffered a head injury in a riding accident years earlier. Since recovery, he has been able to see truths invisible to others. He has discovered that he is the rightful heir to an imperial dynasty of America, that a crown and throne await him, that his cousin Louis stands as obstacle to his destiny. This grandiose delusion presents obvious symptoms of what we might clinically identify as psychotic break. But Chambers complicates this reading by making other characters appear to confirm elements of Hildred's worldview. Mr. Wilde, the repairer of reputations, operates from a disgusting apartment filled with a caged creature Hildred calls his cat, though description suggests something far less ordinary. Wilde traffics in secrets and blackmail, keeps records of everyone's hidden shames, speaks of the king in yellow as if this figure is real and coming to claim dominion. Is Wilde genuinely connected to cosmic forces, or is he simply a delusional charlatan whom Hildred has found and incorporated into his fantasy system? The text supports both readings. The presence of the king in yellow itself remains ambiguous. Hildred references the play, discusses its impact on society, suggests that it has prepared the way for the king's arrival. Other characters acknowledge the play's existence, but we never see anyone who clearly occupies shared reality discussing it. Everyone who mentions the play might be part of Hildred's delusion, or might themselves be contaminated by exposure to it. The story's architecture prevents us from establishing any reliable external perspective. Chambers deploys the unreliable narrator not as twist ending, but as fundamental structure. Unlike stories where you eventually realize the narrator is unreliable, the Repairer of Reputations announces this immediately. Hildred's first descriptions of himself include his head injury and changed perception. We know from the opening that his testimony is suspect. The question becomes, how much of what he tells us is false? Is any of it true? Can we separate delusion from reality when we have no external confirmation? The climax involves Hildred confronting his cousin Louis, proclaiming his own royal status, and being subdued by authorities who treat him as dangerous madman. This appears to confirm the delusion reading. Hildred is simply insane. His entire narrative is fantasy, and the story demonstrates how psychosis constructs elaborate alternate realities. But Chambers includes details that resist this comfortable interpretation. The yellow sign appears on physical objects. Other characters reference Carcosa. The play demonstrably exists in some form. Perhaps Hildred is insane, but perhaps his insanity results from genuine contact with something real that broke his mind's capacity to distinguish shared reality from private vision. This uncertainty becomes the story's true horror. If Hildred is completely delusional, the story is merely psychological study, disturbing but containable. If some element of his claims is true, then the King in Yellow is real within this world. Society has been corrupted by forbidden art, and the reality we assume is stable might not be. Chambers refuses to resolve this ambiguity. The story ends with Hildred institutionalized, raving about his destiny, still believing in the coming of the king. Is this tragic madness or terrible prophecy? We cannot know. The structural sophistication here exceeds what Chambers' contemporaries were attempting in weird fiction. He's not just telling a story with ambiguous monster. He's questioning whether there is a monster, whether the horror is external entity or internal collapse, whether cosmic forces exist or only human minds breaking under their own weight. This anticipates postmodern narrative techniques by decades. The radical unreliability of all narrative positions, the impossibility of securing external validation for our experiences, the vertigo of existing without stable ground for judgment. The repairer of reputations also functions as social satire. The lethal chambers suggest that exposure to certain ideas, specifically to art that reveals existential truth, makes continued existence intolerable. If we accept Hildred's framing, society has collectively glimpsed something that destroys the will to live, and suicide chambers are practical response to mass despair. This is extreme, but it literalizes philosophical questions about meaning and existence. If we truly comprehended our cosmic insignificance, would suicide become rational? Would civilization itself become untenable? Chambers explores these questions through the exaggerated setting while maintaining focus on individual psychology. The story's placement as collection opener is strategically aggressive. Readers encountering the King in Yellow for the first time begin with this radically unstable text that refuses to confirm its own reality status. This primes them for the ambiguity that follows in subsequent stories. By the time they reach the yellow sign, they cannot trust that narrator either. The collection trains its readers to occupy uncertainty, to accept that cosmic horror operates in the space where we cannot determine what is real versus what is delusion, because ultimately that distinction might not hold. The decades following Chambers' death in 1933 saw Hastur mythology evolve through multiple authors, each adding layers that transformed the entity while claiming to preserve its essence. This collaborative expansion reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of shared fictional universes, how they can deepen through accretion, but also dilute through contradiction and over-explanation. August Derleth dominates this period. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth positioned himself as curator and systematizer of what he termed the Cthulhu Mythos, a phrase Lovecraft never used. Derleth's approach was taxonomic. He believed the scattered entities across Lovecraft's and Chambers' work needed organization, hierarchy, clear relationships. His stories imposed a framework. Great Old Ones were evil, opposed by benevolent elder gods, locked in cosmic conflict, divided into elemental categories. The Return of Hastur appeared in Weird Tales in 1939. Derleth's version makes Hastur a wind elemental imprisoned near the star Aldebaran, Cthulhu's half-brother, associated with air as Cthulhu associates with water. The story involves a character reading the Necronomicon and discovering rituals that accidentally summon Hastur to Earth. Derleth describes the manifestation explicitly: winds that destroy buildings, voices in storms, physical devastation. This concreteness betrays the original ambiguity. By showing the entity so directly, Derleth reduced cosmic mystery to fantasy adventure. Derleth's other Hastur stories, the Whippoorwills in the Hills, and several mythos tales that reference the entity, continued this systematization. He created genealogies, mapped cosmic politics, established rules for summoning and banishing entities. This made the material accessible to readers who wanted clear frameworks, but it fundamentally altered the nature of the horror. Chambers' Hastur was effective because you could never quite grasp what it was. Derleth's Hastur became one more monster in a rogue's gallery, powerful but comprehensible, defeatable through specific countermeasures. The philosophical horror collapsed into action-oriented fantasy. Ramsey Campbell represents a different approach. Campbell, writing from Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, took Lovecraftian concepts and relocated them to English settings with working-class protagonists. His Cold Print and other stories reference Hastur peripherally, treating the entity as part of the general background threat of cosmic forces that occasionally intrude into mundane existence. Campbell preserved Lovecraft's sense of vast indifference while adding psychological realism to his characters. His contribution wasn't developing Hastur specifically, but demonstrating how cosmic horror could function in contemporary realistic fiction. Karl Edward Wagner's The River of Night's Dreaming brings Hastur into conversation with historical occultism. Wagner was unique in cosmic horror for his deep knowledge of actual esoteric traditions. His stories blend invented and real occult references so seamlessly that readers often cannot distinguish which is which. This technique recalls Lovecraft's original false authentication strategy, but applies it to grimoire traditions and ritual magic systems. Wagner's Hastur becomes an entity that occultists throughout history might have actually encountered, threading the fiction back through real historical occult texts. The role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, published by Chaosium in 1981, codified Hastur for an entirely new medium. Game designers needed stat blocks, concrete rules, specific information about abilities and limitations. They drew primarily from Derleth's systematization because Chambers' ambiguity couldn't be reduced to game mechanics. The RPG presented Hastur as Great Old One, provided his characteristics and cult practices, included the yellow sign as specific symbol with defined game effects. This version influenced a generation of horror writers who encountered Hastur through gaming before reading original sources. Delta Green, an expansion for Call of Cthulhu published in the 1990s, repositioned cosmic horror in modern conspiracy framework. The game imagined government agencies aware of and actively suppressing mythos threats. Hastur became one more containment problem, to be monitored and neutralized through intelligence operations. This contemporary recontextualization made the entity feel current, but further domesticated the cosmic horror. When you can file reports about Hastur, when he appears on government watch lists, the sense of vast unknowable threat diminishes. Thomas Ligotti's fiction represents return to Chambers' original approach. Ligotti's stories, particularly The Shadow at the Bottom of the World and others collected in Songs of a Dead Dreamer, emphasize existential dread, unreliable perception, and the horror of consciousness itself. Though Ligotti rarely references Hastur directly, his work shares philosophical DNA with Chambers. Both explore how awareness might be curse, how achieving clarity about existence could destroy the capacity to exist. Ligotti updates cosmic horror for postmodern philosophical concerns while maintaining Chambers' essential restraint about what can safely be shown. This expansion across 8 decades demonstrates how shared mythology evolves. Each author shaped Hastur toward their own concerns. Derleth toward systematization, Campbell toward working-class realism, Wagner toward historical occultism, game designers toward playability, Ligotti toward philosophical horror. The entity exists now in multiple contradictory versions with no canonical authority to adjudicate between them. This proliferation actually serves Hastur's essential nature, an entity defined by being unspeakable, unknowable. Resisting definition becomes more true to itself through contradictory accounts. The confusion is not bug, but feature, evidence that we're dealing with something that cannot be pinned down, that changes in the telling, that resists stable meaning even as it proliferates through cultural transmission. The boundary between fiction and belief proves surprisingly permeable when cosmic horror is involved. Hastur mythology, from its earliest circulation, attracted readers who either genuinely believed or chose to perform belief, a distinction that becomes meaningless when the performance itself constitutes the phenomenon. We must examine how fictional entities migrate into claimed reality, how hoaxes function as extension of the original texts, and why Hastur particularly invites this kind of ontological confusion. The first wave of real Hastur claims emerged in occult circles during the 1920s and 1930s. Lovecraft's correspondence mentions receiving letters from readers convinced that the Necronomicon existed as genuine grimoire. Some asked where they could obtain copies. Others claimed to have seen the book in private collections or university libraries. Lovecraft found this amusing initially, often replying with elaborate false histories that deepened the hoax. But the phenomenon revealed something significant. Readers wanted these things to be real. Fiction that presents itself as discovered truth rather than invented story triggers different psychological responses than openly acknowledged fantasy. Hastur benefited from this dynamic because the entity appeared across multiple authors' works. A reader encountering the name in both Chambers and Lovecraft might reasonably conclude that both writers were referencing actual mythology rather than participating in collaborative fiction. The cross-referencing created authentication effect. This is how folklore actually operates, multiple independent accounts appearing to confirm shared reality. That Chambers and Lovecraft were consciously creating this effect did not prevent it from working. Theater provides particularly rich territory for Hastur hoaxes. Throughout the 20th century, rumors circulated about actual productions of The King in Yellow, play that resulted in audience disasters. These stories follow predictable patterns. A theater company stages the forbidden play. The second act drives spectators mad. The production is shut down. All copies are destroyed. Survivors refuse to discuss what they witnessed. No documentary evidence supports any of these accounts, but they proliferate through urban legend transmission. Somebody knew somebody whose cousin attended a performance in Prague in 1927, or Berlin in 1934, or San Francisco in 1952. These stories serve psychological functions beyond simple hoax. They allow people to participate in the mythology, to contribute their own chapters to the collective narrative. Urban legends are collaborative folklore. Each retelling adds details, changes specifics, adapts the story to new contexts. The king and yellow performance disasters represent fan fiction in oral tradition mode. People elaborating on Chambers' premise, testing its implications, imagining what would actually happen if the play were staged. That none of these events occurred historically does not diminish their function as cultural activity. The yellow sign presents different challenges. Unlike the play, which cannot be performed without someone actually writing and staging it, a symbol can be drawn by anyone. Throughout the 20th century, people have created versions of the yellow sign based on minimal descriptions in Chambers' text. These symbols then circulate as if they were the authentic sign, acquiring their own legends about causing unease or psychological effects in observers. This creates self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're told a symbol is disturbing and see it in context that suggests danger, you will likely experience disturbance. The power is real, even though the source is invented. Occult practitioners represent a distinct category. Some magicians and chaos magic practitioners have deliberately incorporated Hastur into ritual work, treating the entity as egregore, a thought form brought into existence through collective belief and imaginative investment. This approach acknowledges the fictional origin while suggesting that sustained attention from thousands of readers across decades might generate something that functions effectively as real entity. Whether this represents genuine magical operation or elaborate roleplay becomes philosophically irrelevant if the effects are indistinguishable. Internet culture accelerated these dynamics. Forums dedicated to cosmic horror host ongoing discussions about whether mythos entities exist, with participants adopting various levels of sincerity. Some argue seriously for reality of these forces. Others engage in elaborate fictional performances. Most occupy ambiguous middle ground, entertaining the premise without committing to belief. The Slender Man phenomenon provides instructive parallel. A completely documented modern invention that nonetheless generated mythology, claimed sightings, and even violence by people who treated the fiction as real or used it as framework for their own disturbed behavior. The question of why Hastur attracts this treatment more than other cosmic entities deserves consideration. Cthulhu is more widely known, but Cthulhu is too concrete. A specific creature with described physical form sleeping in identified location. You can visit the coordinates Lovecraft provided for Arlia and find empty ocean, but Hastur remains undefined enough to seem possible. The entity that operates through information and symbol could plausibly exist because ideas demonstrably do propagate and affect consciousness. The yellow sign could function mimetically even if Hastur's entity is fictional. This plausibility makes the mythology more productive for people wanting to believe or perform belief. Contemporary conspiracy culture shows how Hastur-style mythology maps onto real-world paranoia. QAnon and similar movements operate through cryptic symbols, hidden knowledge, initiates who claim to see patterns invisible to others, warnings about information that will destroy those who learn it. These are the structures of cosmic horror deployed for political purposes. The difference is that QAnon believers think they're revealing truth, while cosmic horror acknowledges it's exploring fictional dread. But the boundary erodes when people start treating fiction as decoded reality. Some percentage of people encountering Hastur mythology will always insist it's real, and no amount of evidence proving fictional origin will convince them otherwise, because the mythology itself contains built-in explanations for why authorities would deny its reality. Hastur presents unusual challenges for adaptation beyond literature. The entity's power derives from being suggested, rather than shown, from operating through information rather than physical presence. Visual and interactive media struggle with this approach because these forms demand concrete representation. We must examine how various media have attempted to translate Hastur's essential ambiguity while acknowledging that most adaptations fundamentally alter what they're adapting. Film has largely failed Hastur. No major film adaptation directly addresses the entity, though elements appear in various productions. The primary reason is structural. Cinema requires visual specificity. Directors must show something, and whatever gets shown becomes the definitive version for that production. This definiteness contradicts everything that makes Hastur effective. The few attempts to incorporate king and yellow elements into film typically cherry-pick aesthetic details. Yellow robes, tattered costume, mysterious symbols, while abandoning the philosophical horror that justifies these images. The most significant film reference appears in HBO's True Detective first season, 2014. Creator Nick Pizzolatto drew heavily on cosmic horror imagery, particularly Chambers' mythology. The serial killer case involves references to the Yellow King. Carcosa appears as location name. Victims are posed in ritualistic configurations, suggesting occult significance. The series uses these elements as atmospheric texture rather than literal mythology. The Yellow King might be cult leader, shared delusion among damaged people, or symbolic representation of evil itself. The ambiguity works because the show treats cosmic horror as aesthetic and philosophical framework, rather than explaining everything literally. True Detective's approach demonstrates successful adaptation strategy. Use Hastur elements as language for exploring existential themes, rather than treating the entity as monster to be defeated. The show's meditation on time, meaning, and cosmic indifference aligns with Chambers and Lovecraft's philosophical concerns. References to Carcosa and the Yellow King function as shorthand, signaling to informed viewers that this narrative operates in cosmic horror territory. The show trusts audience intelligence enough to leave connections implicit rather than explicit. Role-playing games represent the most extensive Hastur adaptations. Call of Cthulhu, published by Chaosium in 1981, needed to systematize cosmic horror for game mechanics. The designers faced impossible task. How do you make unknowable entities statistically knowable? Their solution was compromise. Provide enough concrete information for gameplay while preserving atmosphere of dread. Hastur appears with defined characteristics, cult practices, summoning rituals. Players can research the entity, encounter cultists, potentially face Hastur-related threats. The game acknowledges it's reducing cosmic horror to manageable fantasy, but accepts this as necessary for playability. Delta Green, expanding Call of Cthulhu into modern conspiracy. Framework repositioned Hastur as active contemporary threat. Published initially as sourcebook in 1997, Delta Green imagined covert government agencies monitoring and suppressing mythos manifestations. Hastur becomes classified threat, tracked through intelligence channels, subject to containment protocols. This modernization makes the entity feel relevant to contemporary paranoia about government secrets and hidden knowledge. The game mechanics still require concreteness, but the setting's conspiratorial realism creates new kind of dread. Not cosmic indifference, but bureaucratic response to cosmic horror, which might be worse. Video games offer interactive possibilities unavailable to other media. Bloodborne, 2015, though not explicitly Hastur-focused, demonstrates how games can explore cosmic horror themes through environmental storytelling and gradual revelation. Players begin in gothic horror setting that slowly reveals cosmic underpinnings. Knowledge itself becomes dangerous. Learning too much about the game's true nature causes your character to gain insight, which has both beneficial and detrimental effects. This mechanizes the concept of forbidden knowledge corrupting consciousness. Several independent games have attempted direct Hastur adaptations with varying success. These typically struggle with the same problem as film. Games require interaction. Interaction requires defined rules. Defined rules eliminate ambiguity. The most effective approaches use Hastur as background presence rather than direct antagonist, something that shapes the world and narrative without becoming boss fight to defeat. When cosmic horror becomes combat encounter, it ceases being cosmic horror. Music might be the medium most naturally suited to Hastur's themes. Sound operates through suggestion and atmosphere, can create dread without requiring visual specificity. Death metal bands have extensively mined mythos mythology for lyrics and imagery. Morbid Angels, Altars of Madness, The Chasm's Work, countless others reference Hastur and related entities. These musical treatments rarely attempt narrative depth. They use cosmic horror as source of powerful imagery for extreme music's aesthetic of transgression and apocalypse. Dark ambient and experimental music approaches Hastur more philosophically. Artists like Atrium Carceri, Kamarheit, and others working in isolationist ambient create soundscapes that evoke cosmic dread without lyrics or narrative. These compositions explore what forbidden knowledge might sound like. Dissonant harmonies that suggest wrongness, frequencies that create unease, silence that feels pregnant with approaching revelation. This abstract approach aligns more closely with Chambers' original project than narrative adaptations. Theater represents perhaps the most conceptually interesting adaptation possibility. Actually staging the King in Yellow would require solving the problem Chambers deliberately left unsolved. What does the catastrophic second act contain? Several experimental theater groups have attempted this, using various strategies. Some present only the first act, ending with characters preparing to perform the second act that audience never sees. Others use multimedia, sensory overload, or participatory elements to create overwhelming experience that simulates knowledge exceeding cognitive capacity. None achieve what Chambers' text accomplishes, because actual theater cannot match imagined horror, but these attempts honor the premise by accepting they will inevitably fail. Hastur mythology has been appropriated by various subcultures and academic disciplines, each finding different utility in the entity's ambiguous nature. These appropriations reveal what different communities need from cosmic horror, how they adapt it to their concerns, and what happens when fictional constructs migrate into serious intellectual discourse. Gothic and industrial subcultures adopted Yellow King aesthetics during the 1990s and 2000s. The imagery fit perfectly: decadent decay, forbidden knowledge, aristocratic corruption, symbols of transformation through suffering. Musicians and visual artists incorporated tattered yellow robes, pallid masks, references to Carcosa into album artwork and stage performances. This appropriation was largely surface level, extracting visual vocabulary without engaging philosophical depth. But it served subcultural function of marking identity, signaling affiliation with dark romanticism and rejection of mainstream aesthetic values. Steampunk and Victorian revivalism found Hastur useful for different reasons. Chambers wrote during 1890s, which makes his mythology temporally aligned with steampunk's historical fetish. The King in Yellow fits Victorian decadence, the period's anxieties about degeneration, the fascination with forbidden texts, the sense of civilization teetering on collapse. Steampunk practitioners incorporate Hastur elements as authentic Victorian weirdness, using the mythology to add genuine historical horror texture to their anachronistic fantasies. Academic weird fiction studies began seriously examining Chambers in the 1990s and 2000s. Previously dismissed as minor author of Forgotten Potboilers, Chambers' The King in Yellow received scholarly reappraisal. Critics recognized the sophistication of his narrative techniques, the philosophical depth underlying his horror, the influence on subsequent weird fiction development. S.T. Joshi's scholarship on Lovecraft necessarily covered Chambers as significant influence. Other scholars examined Chambers in context of fin de siècle literary culture, demonstrating how The King in Yellow engaged contemporary debates about degeneration, symbolism, and aesthetic philosophy. This academic attention revealed that Chambers was more intellectually serious than his later commercial career suggested. His cosmic horror emerged from genuine engagement with French symbolist, poetry, European decadence, contemporary psychology. The stories were not just scary tales, but philosophical investigations disguised as weird fiction. This realization elevated Chambers' reputation, making him subject of dissertations, conference panels, scholarly articles in serious journals. Semiotics and language philosophy found Hastur particularly productive. The yellow sign represents perfect test case for discussions about how signs function. What happens when signifier and signified collapse into each other? Whether symbols can possess agency. Jacques Derrida never wrote about Hastur, but his theories about language's instability, the play of signifiers, the impossibility of presence, could describe exactly what Chambers was exploring fictionally. Several scholars have used Hastur to illustrate semiotic concepts, demonstrating how cosmic horror dramatizes language philosophy. Information theory and memetics discovered useful analogies in Hastur mythology. Richard Dawkins coined meme in 1976 to describe units of cultural information that replicate using human minds as substrate. Subsequent memetics research explored how ideas spread, mutate, compete for attention. Hastur represents hostile meme, information that damages its host while compelling transmission. This isn't just metaphor. The stories literally describe ideas that propagate themselves while destroying the consciousnesses they inhabit. Hastur becomes exemplar of informational pathogen concept. Recent discussions in AI safety and information hazards have referenced cosmic horror explicitly. Philosophers and computer scientists working on artificial intelligence problems consider whether certain knowledge might be inherently dangerous. Not because of how it's used, but because knowing it restructures thinking in catastrophic ways. Eliezer Yudkowsky and others in rationalist community have discussed basilisk scenarios where learning specific information commits you to course of action cannot escape. These concerns directly parallel Hastur's forbidden knowledge premise. The yellow sign operates exactly like information hazard. You cannot unknow it once known, and knowing it changes you in ways you cannot control. Trauma theory found unexpected resonance with Hastur themes. Trauma creates knowledge that cannot be processed or narrated safely. Traumatic experience exceeds the mind's capacity to integrate it into coherent narrative, which leads to dissociation, flashbacks, repetition compulsion. The unspeakable in trauma theory refers to experiences that resist language, that cannot be communicated without re-traumatizing. Hastur operates through similar mechanisms. Knowledge that shatters narrative coherence, that cannot be communicated without contaminating others, that creates permanent rupture in consciousness. Some trauma scholars have used cosmic horror as metaphor for trauma's effects, while others suggest the metaphor is too literal. Both describe actual limitations of human consciousness when confronted with certain realities. Occult revival movements represent different appropriation. Since the 1970s, chaos magic practitioners have deliberately worked with fictional entities, treating them as valid as traditionally real gods. Peter Carroll and other chaos magic theorists argue that all gods are essentially fictional constructs made functional through belief and ritual investment. From this perspective, Hastur is precisely as real as any deity, an egregore sustained by collective imagination, capable of producing genuine effects in practitioners' consciousness and circumstances. These magicians perform rituals invoking Hastur, create sigils based on yellow sign descriptions, meditate on Carcosa as initiatory landscape. Whether this constitutes genuine magical practice or elaborate role play becomes irrelevant if the phenomenological effects are indistinguishable. These diverse appropriations demonstrate Hastur's unusual flexibility. The entity can be used for subcultural identity marking, academic analysis of language and consciousness, modeling information hazards in AI research, understanding trauma psychology, or actual magical practice. Each use finds something genuine in the mythology, philosophical concepts that remain valid regardless of fictional origin. This versatility suggests Chambers identified real patterns in how consciousness, language, and knowledge interact, even though he expressed these patterns through invented mythology. The fiction touches truth, which allows it to be appropriated for serious purposes without violating its essential nature. We arrive finally at the question of why Hastur persists when countless other fictional entities have faded into obscurity. What needs does this mythology serve? What philosophical and psychological work does it accomplish that keeps people returning to these stories, elaborating on these themes, finding new applications for these concepts? The answer requires examining both what cosmic horror offers and what specifically distinguishes Hastur within that tradition. Cosmic horror in general provides therapeutic function in secular age. Traditional religion offered explanations for suffering, frameworks for meaning, promises of ultimate justice. As religious certainty declined in Western cultures, people required new methods for confronting existential anxiety. Cosmic horror provides this by making insignificance explicit. You are not suffering because you sinned or because God tests you. You suffer because the universe is vast, indifferent, and you are utterly insignificant within it. This is horrifying but also oddly comforting. Your problems are not cosmically important, which means you can stop expecting them to be resolved through cosmic intervention. The horror creates permission to accept meaninglessness without despair. Hastur offers specific variation within cosmic horror tradition. Where Cthulhu represents physical insignificance, the tiny human confronting enormous alien god, Hastur represents epistemic insignificance. The horror is not that you're small, but that your capacity for understanding is fundamentally limited. There exist truths you cannot safely know, concepts that will break your mind through mere comprehension. This maps onto real experiences of intellectual limitation, the frustration of approaching ideas that seem just beyond grasp, the suspicion that some questions might not have answers, compatible with continued sanity. The entity's emphasis on information as threat resonates with contemporary information environment. We live in conditions of information overload where knowledge has become overwhelming rather than empowering. The internet provides access to effectively infinite information, most of which is contradictory, much of which is deliberately misleading. People report feeling that consuming too much information causes psychological damage, anxiety, paranoia, attention fragmentation, inability to distinguish truth from fabrication. Hastur mythology provides framework for understanding these experiences. The yellow sign becomes metaphor for viral misinformation, for conspiracy theories that capture minds and refuse to release them, for traumatic content that circulates despite warnings. The unspeakable carries particular weight in context of trauma discourse. Modern psychology recognizes that certain experiences resist narration, that language fails when attempting to communicate extreme suffering or violation. Trauma survivors describe inability to articulate what happened to them, or finding that when they do articulate it, listeners cannot understand or believe the testimony. This creates profound isolation, the knowledge that sets you apart from others, that cannot be shared, that marks you permanently. Hastur externalizes this internal experience, makes it cosmic rather than personal, which might offer strange relief by suggesting the problem is not individual failure, but fundamental limitation of human communication. The philosophical concept of dangerous knowledge appears increasingly relevant as scientific research approaches questions about consciousness, reality's fundamental nature, and humanity's place in cosmos. Physicists and philosophers sometimes discuss whether certain discoveries might be psychologically destabilizing, learning we live in simulation, confirming that consciousness is purely mechanical with no special status, discovering that reality operates on principles completely incompatible with human intuition. These are Hastur questions. They ask whether some truths might be functionally forbidden, not because anyone prohibits them, but because knowing them would destroy the knower's capacity to function. The entity's resistance to definition becomes philosophically productive in postmodern context. Postmodernism emphasizes instability of meaning, impossibility of fixed interpretation, playfulness of signifiers that never settle into definitive signifieds. Hastur enacts these principles, an entity that changes with each telling, that accumulates contradictory attributes across texts, that cannot be pinned down to stable definition. Working with Hastur means accepting uncertainty, operating in space where meaning perpetually differs. This provides training ground for navigating contemporary reality, where certainty increasingly seems unavailable. Yellow as symbolic color gains new significance in contemporary context. The color marks caution, warning tape, hazard signs, alerts that danger exists. But yellow also appears in revolutionary contexts. Yellow vests protests, yellow ribbons, yellow as color of resistance and visibility. Chambers' use of yellow taps both associations. The yellow sign warns and attracts simultaneously. It marks danger, but also promises revelation. This dual function reflects ambivalent relationship with forbidden knowledge. We know we should avoid it, but cannot resist approaching it. The king in yellow figure represents aristocratic corruption, the ruler who spreads madness rather than maintaining order. This resonates with contemporary distrust of authority and elites. When leaders appear disconnected from reality, when their communications seem designed to confuse rather than clarify, when following their direction leads to disaster, the king in yellow becomes political metaphor. The entity who rules through propagating insanity describes real experiences of being governed by people who seem themselves insane or who deliberately cultivate mass delusion. Carcosa, as impossible city, reflects urban anxiety and architectural uncanny. Modern cities grow incomprehensible through scale and complexity. People live in environments they cannot fully map mentally, surrounded by structures whose purposes remain opaque. The experience of not understanding your own city, of getting lost in familiar places, of encountering neighborhoods that feel fundamentally wrong. These are Carcosa experiences. The dream city that shouldn't exist but does maps onto real disorientation in contemporary urban spaces. The ultimate question is whether Hastur represents anything real beyond fiction. The answer depends on what real means. As literal entity, no, but as pattern, as description of how consciousness, information, and meaning interact under certain conditions? Perhaps. Chambers identified something genuine about dangerous knowledge, about symbols that corrupt, about understanding that destroys the understander. These are real phenomena, even if the entity itself is invented. The mythology provides language for experiences that otherwise resist articulation. This is why Hastur endures. Not because people believe in literal king in yellow, but because the mythology captures real features of consciousness and knowledge that remain difficult to discuss otherwise. We need frameworks for talking about information hazards, about trauma that resists narration, about knowledge that damages, about meaning that collapses under scrutiny. Cosmic horror provides these frameworks through dramatic externalization. The internal experience becomes cosmic entity, which makes it discussable, shareable, usable for various purposes. The final irony is that discussing Hastur extensively might itself constitute the kind of activity the mythology warns against. By analyzing the entity, explaining its philosophical implications, tracing its cultural influence, we spread awareness of the concept. We make more people familiar with the yellow sign, with Carcosa, with the idea of forbidden knowledge. If the mythology were literally true, this analysis would be a dangerous act of transmission. That its fiction provides safety, or so we assume. But the boundary between analyzing dangerous ideas and propagating them remains uncertain. Perhaps Hastur's final horror is making us question whether we should have remained silent, whether some things lose power only when forgotten, whether this entire investigation was itself the trap closing around us. The play continues. The yellow sign circulates. Carcosa persists at the edge of vision. And whether we have examined a dead author's century-old fiction or participated in something older and more patient than we can safely recognize, remains, as it must, unanswered.